The reason I am here is probably because the main organizer of this meeting, Mr. Olteanu, thought that my name and my function as an inspector will make a good impression on the observation of the time limits. It seems indeed that the only limit to the freedom of speech in this conference is the time constraint. During the first panel today, the most used words after freedom, religion, refugees, and migrants were 5 minutes. I want to remind respectfully all distinguished speakers to the key concept of the 5 minutes. As Benjamin Franklin put it, you may delay, but the time will not. The better news is that the organizer did not surprise any of the speakers with the questions they are expected to answer. And I will remind them. Question number 1, to which extent does the protection of refugees, migrants, and religious minorities contribute to the advancement of the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development? The next question, how the inclusion of refugees and migrants can be balanced with sustainable peace and development in the countries of origin? Question number 3, what specific steps should be taken vis-à-vis religious minorities in order to promote and foster the Sustainable Development Goals agenda? I was suggested by the organizers to invite you to consider not to say everything that you know about the matter, all your reflection. We'd like to allow more time for interaction, so concision and the respect of the 5 minutes rules is very important. With no further ado, then, I give the floor to Mr. Rudelmar Bueno de FARIA, Secretary General of ACT Alliance. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this very important and topical summit. For those who do not know, ACT Alliance is a global network of 150 churches and faith-based organizations operating in more than 140 countries, working with the most marginalized, with the aim of leaving no one behind. Our members are engaged in humanitarian assistance, development, and also advocacy action. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce briefly some of the ways in which the objective of this summit is connected to a broader policy and political agenda. Without connecting the dots, I fear, we will not be able to fully achieve our aim to promote the Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development. The SDGs, as the subject of this panel, provide a useful framework for these discussions. 2 of the 2030 Agenda's most well-known calls to the international communities are leave no one behind and reach the furthest behind first. Yet, we often find people on the move, for whatever reason, left behind when it comes to being able to access the full spectrums of their human rights and to live with dignity. Hate speech and radicalizations are fueling a culture of spite that is skyrocketing crimes against minorities. Being part of religious minorities, but also ethnic, sexual, and gender identity minorities can expose those groups to persecution. They are forced to flee their homes. They are disadvantaged in a myriad of subtle ways. The protection of refugees, migrants, and religious minorities can contribute, of course, to the 2030 Agenda. From a policy perspective, the rights of such groups are addressed in several of the SDGs. I will only highlight a few of them here. SDG 5 on gender equality, in terms of elimination of trafficking and sexual and other types of exploitations. The SDG 8 on decent work, eradication of forced labor, modern slavery, and human trafficking, and also the promotion of labor rights for migrant workers, in particular women migrants. SDG 10 on reducing inequalities, facilitation of orderly, safe, regular, and responsible migrations and mobility of people, and well-managed migration policies. SDG 13 on climate actions, with migration increasingly becoming an adaptation strategy for affected people. SDG 16 on promotion of peace, reduction of violence, abuse, exploitation, and trafficking, and the promotion of rule of law and access to justice. And of course, SDG 17 on global partnerships. These policies issues, brilliantly framed by the SDGs, have to be addressed. They are the underlying causes behind the symptoms that you are discussing here today. Nevertheless, we need to be aware that the rapid and changing political, social, cultural, and economical contexts are posing challenges to humanity, to organizations and institutions that strive to uphold human rights, promote justice, and address inequalities in the world today. In many countries, the existing simplistic, polarized, fundamentalist narratives monopolize the public sphere, hindering the task of those who try to bridge the gap with balanced and moderate views that acknowledge the multi-casual nature of poverty, conflicts, exclusion, discriminations, and hate speech. Marginalization and discriminations are the symptoms of a broader mindset which systematically denies rights to the different, the weak, the outsider, the foreigner, and which, by doing so, endangers the rights of everyone. Therefore, one of the sine qua non steps to address these challenges and foster the SDGs is to recognize the intersections of religious, political, and economic fundamentalisms in redefining values, realigning institutions, and undermining human rights, pushing people and nations to dangerous positions. Looking this from a political viewpoint, we will see the protection of religious minorities, refugees, and migrants as a comprehensive, whole-of-society strategy rather than one targeted activity. The participants of this second global summit include actors within the Dialogue 5 group that are diplomats, politicians, religious leaders, scholars, and civil society. Within our different truths, we need to find the way to work on these intersections and intentionally accommodate human rights values and standards in our policies and actions. We need to put in the time and efforts to identify the specific advocacy agendas and policy asks that safeguard the rights and dignity of people on the move everywhere. This is the only way to build bridges, foster inclusivity, and counter hate speech in order to enhance the protection of religious minorities, refugees, and migrants. Thank you very much.
That was perfect, both in content and in terms of timing. We thank you very much for this rich interpretation of the overarching principle of the Agenda 2030, leaving no one behind. I now give the floor to the next speaker, Dr. Elisabeta KITANOVIC, Executive Secretary for Human Rights and Communication, Church and Society Commission, Council of European Churches. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you. I would like, first of all, to thank the organizers for inviting the Conference of European Churches to take the participation in this important global summit. The subject of protection of refugees, migrants, and religious minorities is a growing matter for churches and religious communities. The center of this subject is actually protection of human dignity for all people. The implementation of the UN Agenda 2030 and its goals 16 and 17 are basically the key priorities of the work of the Conference of European Churches. The Conference of European Churches encompasses more than 110 member churches from the Oriental and Eastern Orthodox, from historic and Free Church Protestant, as well as from the Anglican and Old Catholic traditions, based in approximately 40 European countries. A majority of its members are minority churches. This broad scope of the conference constituency reflects and through its work strengthens religious and multicultural plurality in Europe. This is why Conference of European Churches regularly addresses the subject of the rights of religious minorities in Europe, adding a competence to the debate that is based both on practical experience, political advocacy, and academic reflection. Minority churches, and indeed religious minorities in general, face many challenges in Europe and beyond. Some struggle with attaining an appropriate legal status. Others are subject to discrimination, exclusion, or even open hostility against individual members and the entire community. Complaints range from widespread prejudices to destruction or even demolition or confiscation of property, obstructions to religious rituals and ceremonies, to the need for protection by police or even military. In cases where there is a strong historic bond between state and society and a specific religion, minorities can at times also be regarded as dissenters and therefore disloyal citizens. While the Conference of European Churches is convinced that minorities bring an added value to the societies, sometimes governments do not see that, but treat them as a threat to the national security. Quite often, the state officials lack religious literacy and have not yet developed a deeper understanding of the benefits that can bring from creating space for religious minorities to flourish. The Conference of European Churches, for this purpose, has organized a conference in Zagreb, in Croatia, together with Churches Commission for Migrants in Europe, Diocese of Zagreb and Ljubljana of the Serbian Orthodox Church, and European Parliament Anti-Racism and Diversity Intergroup. And therefore, at this occasion, the participants discussed the subjects like European and national legal standards on the protection of the rights of religious minorities, current challenges, but also best practices to ensure fair treatment of religious minorities in Europe. Special attention was given at that moment to the role of international actors in combating violations of fundamental rights of religious minorities. As was underlined in various processes of international and European institutions, respect and understanding of different narratives, identities, cultures and religions are constituent to European societies. International, European and national legislation regulates the relationship between the state and religious and ethnic minorities. Nevertheless, this question is complex, as states do not all share the same definition as to who should be recognized as a minority. It is important to guarantee recognition, respect, equal treatment and protection for all minorities. The essence of minority protection is to provide the space and conditions allowing all to live peacefully without fear of discrimination or pressure of assimilation, and to develop with specific as well as multiple identities. Aware of the part religion has played and still plays in situations of conflict, and conscious of our responsibility as churches towards peaceful coexistence of different communities in our societies, this consultation of the Conference of European Churches and its partners asked European institutions, especially in Brussels, as well as United Nations and their member participating states, to assume, in accordance with their obligations under law, the responsibility for preventing and punishing hate crimes and breaking the cycle of violence, also seeking cooperation with civil society, churches and religious communities, producing a report about the states of the rights of religious minorities, implementing all pertinent legislation protecting the status and rights of minorities, ensuring conditions that enable individuals and groups to coexist in diversity, and creating a positive climate for expression of pluralism, tolerance and respect as the cornerstones of democratic societies, as well promoting ongoing dialogue between majorities and minorities so as to form a common basis of ideals and values for convivence in our own pluralistic and diverse societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yet another demonstration that 5 minutes might be enough to express a richness of ideas. Thank you for the analysis that you made, very subtle analysis on the prejudices against minorities, which actually led to the development of whatever you have as international law to protect minorities at this point in time in Europe and in the United Nations. May I now give the floor to the next speaker, who is Mr. Joao Martins, Director of ADRA Europe. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the privilege of addressing such a distinguished assembly. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. It's a privilege to be here and to co-sponsor this very high-quality conference, summit, and be here together with all of you. For ADRA, as a faith-based NGO, it really makes sense for us to be here and to express our solidarity and our work with all the refugees around the world. It is a privilege to share with you, for myself, some ideas regarding the freedom of conscience and how its violation creates conditions to the existence of refugees in the light of the Sustainable Development Goals. As it was already referred, the Sustainable Development Goals are addressing the refugee conditions in several of the points. I would just like to emphasize two of them. The first is the SDG 10, related to reduced inequalities. In the point 10.7, it aims to facilitate orderly, safe, and responsible migration and mobility of people, including through implementation of planned and well-managed migration policies. So, what we are discussing here today is, of course, under the SDGs umbrella. When we look at the refugee situation in the world, we can see that this may be one of the points where we risk to fail the SDGs targets if we are not careful enough. The recently approved UN Compact of Refugees may be an excellent tool to contradict this trend, but we need the political will to put it into practice. I would like to start by exploring the freedom of conscience as a factor that triggers the existence of refugees. When defining refugees, the Article 1A of the 1951 UN Convention relating to the status of refugees presents religion as the second in the list of reasons for the persecution of a refugee. It is unquestionable that when we presently look at the countries of origin of most of the refugees, that these conflicts are undermined by religious reasons. So, many of these refugees are fleeing for lack of freedom of conscience. No one would disagree with the religious background of the conflicts in Syria, Afghanistan, South Sudan, or the Rohingya crisis. These three crises only originated 68% of all the refugees in 2017, according to the UNHCR. Unfortunately, often only as an excuse, religion is being used as a reason for persecution and the existence of refugees. My second thought, Mr. Chairman, this afternoon, is on what are the implications of the refugees present in hosting countries, and particularly in Europe. In spite of all the news and fake news since 2015, with the so-called migrant crisis, the number of refugees and asylum seekers is proportionally meager in Europe when compared with other regions of the world. 85% of the refugees are hosted in developing countries. However, we can see that the political speech in Europe has become much focused on the fact that time and the instigation of a sense of fear has created many challenges in the public opinion and even in the decision of the European electorates. Populism and extreme right parties are taking advantage of this fact as an opportunity to grow, and unfortunately, we see many examples of this in several countries. The argument behind these protectionist ideas is related to a sense of invasion of different customs, cultures, and obviously religions. Conscious issues are used and abused by some to create barriers. But also, we have to admit that the religious way of life that some of these refugees have creates often some clashes with the traditions and habits of the hosting countries. And here, some challenges may also arise. The factor of religion is paramount when we look at the reality of the integration of refugees, particularly in the continent where we are now, in Europe. The faith of the hosting community must be demystified to the refugees and vice versa. Finally, I would like to take a look at the Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which relates to access to quality in education. If we think that 52% of the refugees are under 18, it's easy to understand that as they are in the move or in countries where they are not integrated, the access to school system is minimal, and most of these children have no access to education. If the international community does not act accordingly, the risk of having a generation that is lost in these communities is very high, prolonging the exclusion and lack of opportunities for these refugees, not only now, but in the future. This is one of the reasons why ADRA has a global campaign that calls exactly for action in favor of these children, standing up for every child, everywhere, in school. In conclusion, I believe that presently we have a single opportunity to show that the rhetoric of pursuing tolerance, social justice, solidarity, and respect for human rights can be put into practice. As the UN Secretary-General António Guterres, that as his birthday today, 17th anniversary, as he stated last year, I ask you to remember the refugees. Their story is one of resilience, perseverance, and courage. Our story must be of solidarity, compassion, and action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martins, for ably demonstrating us that the achievement of the SDG goals is one of the way of improving the situation of people across the world, and that preventing refugees crisis and other kind of crisis, and also for warning us about the dangers which we all know about the political manipulation of the reality under the facts related to refugees and migrants. I now give the floor to Mrs. Sana Mustafa, co-founder of the Network for the Refugees' Voice. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you. And thank you all for having me here. I don't really have a presentation. Maybe we're going to have a conversation. And I would like to start by addressing maybe more the bigger question of the role of religious leaders in the protection of refugees, migrants, and religious minorities. And by that, the first thing comes to mind as a refugee is the role of religious leaders in addressing the root causes. I do not think we can be fair to talk about refugee crisis without addressing the root causes. And I understand how political it is to address the root causes, but I guess it's really, the religious leaders are the most qualified people to address these causes, considering their historical role of being intermediate in these conflicts. For example, in Syria now, if you want to talk about UN and SDGs and no one left behind, we have millions of Syrians left behind, and they continue to be left behind as long as the conflict is not addressed. Also, the role of religious leaders goes beyond to bringing justice to us refugees and migrants after we left, and to those who were left behind by addressing and doing advocacy work on the importance of accountability and war crimes. And this is really this is very attached part to all the refugees' lives and refugees, the refugee crisis. And also the role goes beyond this, also for refugees in host countries. So the role of religious leaders and for refugees in host countries is to also do political advocacy on providing good living conditions for refugees in host countries, whether we're talking about neighboring countries or Europe or elsewhere. It's actually the role of everyone, not only religious leaders, all stakeholders to work with governments to give the right to work for people. It's the role of religious leaders as well to work with governments to give legal protections for refugees, to give them long-term status, all of this. It's not only the role of those who do political advocacy. And I think that's really one of the main issues that we see this divide amongst the different stakeholders that doing work on refugees. It's like everyone has a role and they do not do something else. There's an urge here for the importance of bridging between whatever your institutions are doing and the policies and where you're working. And all of this, all of the things that I said before cannot be done correctly and in a true way if it's not done with refugees, not for refugees. And all of this I'm saying really with refugees, and it's really disturbing how much I heard here the word helping refugees and beneficiaries and vulnerables. And I, as a refugee myself, this is not true. I mean, there are a lot of us that really ready to help and work with you on the same level. And just like terminology speaking, no one is helping anyone here. It's transactional. Every single person person is getting something out of it, whether it's the self-fulfillment or your salary at the end of the day or whatever it is. So just to be fair, I think the language is something that very important to address. Talking about what could be done to contribute to peace, to the peace process and development, again, this is not only the role of religious actors, this is the role of religious actors, of private sector, of NGOs, of refugees themselves. And to be able to do so, we should all work together as, comprehensively sitting on the table, all of us, and addressing these issues, and actually giving a way for refugees to be able to contribute to peace processes in their homeland. Because as of now, there is actually no proper pathway for refugees to actually contribute to building their homes. So even if we want to talk about repatriation, no one is addressing, as we said, again, the root causes. How do we talk about reconstruction and repatriation to Syria? And now there's a lot of NGOs and religious actors and governments want to be involved in the reconstruction only under the purpose that refugees would return. Return to what? And return to where? There is no justice, it's not safe, it's not secure, and the war is still happening. So it's just, honestly, to live up to the core of religions, we have to speak up for those people. And speaking up does not only mean by actually providing food and shelter once we flee, it's mean by preventing us from fleeing, keeping us home, safe in our homes. And one last comment I want to say, I've heard, here a lot of talks happened on integration, and really disturbing how much we talk about integration as refugees integrating in their communities. In my understanding, integration is a two-way process. I think here we're talking about assimilation more than integration. How much the host community is actually learning also about the people who are coming to their countries, how much we're bridging between that. There's a lot of high expectations and pressure, to be honest, on us as refugees, that we have to fulfill these perfect pictures of what a refugee should look like, how I should act in my new host country, what language I should speak, and the list goes on. And I'm not saying this is not important, but also I should have the matter of choice of how I want to live in the new country without feeling the pressure of the high expectations, and that my status of being safe and living safe in this country is actually threatened by the fact how I eat on the table and my table manners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sana, for your genuine and authentic testimony and for your excellent from-the-field analysis of the solutions and the causes of the various crises and the role of religious leaders. Mark Twain used to say, "Tell the truth, and you should not don't have to remember anything." I think that your presentation was a kind of echo of that saying. Thank you very much, and I give the floor to Dr. Mohamed El Sanusi, the Executive Director of the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemakers.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much, moderator, and I would like also to thank the organizers for this conference, the international associations for the defense of religious liberty, and of course, the United Nations Office for the Prevention of Genocide. Sana set the bar so high, so I have some difficulties to follow what actually Sana has said. But the good news is, this is not coordinated at all. So this is the first time actually we met here in this stage with Sana. But we have so much in commonality. She leads the network. I also lead the network for religious and traditional actors. She spoke about the role of the religious and traditional actors, and I'm going to do the same. She also spoke about, the importance of the correct usage of terminology, and I wanted to emphasize that as well. So beginning from that, I would like to make sure that when we speak about minority, we make sure we speak about numerical minority, minority in number. Because when you are minority somewhere, you are majority somewhere else. So it is very important to terminology, numerical minority. So when we talk about minority, let's make that clear. And I'm saying this because I want to really focus my presentation here on the minorities that are numerical minorities that are essential components of societies, wherever they are, whether they're in the Middle East or in the West or wherever they are. They are an essential component, so we need to make sure that component is not missing. Then the role of religious actors and traditional actors becomes very important. And this is an area that is, of course, need a lot of attention here. And currently, when we talk about minority, unfortunately, numerical minority, unfortunately, we see today there are a lot of interest groups that their interest actually to to have these numerical minorities fleeing their countries. And unfortunately, today also, we see a lot of Western governments are actually collecting facts that are necessary for us. But we are not focusing on advancing the positive initiatives that aim to help those who are numerical minorities. So, and I say this all the time. For instance, we have reports coming from my own country, United States, every year on religious freedom, right? Spending a lot of resources on this. But at the end of the day, there is little there to support positive initiatives that actually advance the right of numerical minorities wherever they are. So I think that's also something that we need to speak about it. Yesterday, you heard Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya spoke about the Marrakesh Declaration. These documents I consider to be one of those positive documents that could support religious numerical minorities to stay where they are, to give them all the rights. This is coming from Muslim scholars. Similarly, other religious communities and other religious actors and leaders, they need to look into their theology and come up with documents that also support the rights of those who are numerical minorities. So supporting these positive initiatives and translating that to policy is something that is very critical. And religious actors, my colleagues and friends here spoke about SDGs. And I don't want to touch there, but I want to focus really on the SDG 17. SDG 17 is so critical. We need to strengthen that collaboration between religious actors and traditional actors and government and NGOs and civil society. Strengthening those kind of relationships are very critical to advance our agenda. That is what SDG 17 is. It's very critical to focus on that as well. Then why we are actually talking a lot about the religious actors and their role? Because the reality of the matter is when chaos happens in these countries, and we have a lot of countries in chaos today, these are realities, but they are institutions that is still there. These institutions, these are religious institutions. These are worship places. They are there, and the little peace that we see today in some of these countries because of the existence of these institutions and religious actors, because they have reach to the masses. They can keep a level. So these people need support. These people need to listen to. Their voice need to be heard. We need to advocate for religious actors and leaders and their role. And I see this is happening now. I'm so happy to see the United Nations, and of course, His Excellency Adam Diang is here, his office work on supporting religious actors and coming up with the plan of actions to even further supporting them. I see also other international institutions are doing this. So this is very important. But lastly, we cannot do all of this if we are not inclusive enough. So again, SDG 5, mentioned by my friend Rudelmar earlier, SDG 5, the concept of no one left behind is important. Everyone needs to be in this table as we move forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. El-Sanoussi. As a servant of United Nations in our house, I'm grateful to you for mentioning actually the goal number 17, which is a global partnership. And I would say that the Dialogue 5, the initiative of the association, is actually a reflection on this global partnership. And also you mentioned the importance of good practices. That is something indeed that we should reflect more, and you should also examine at some point in time why media does not work with us in those partnerships to put an emphasis also on the good practices, not only on the bad news. Thank you very much, and I give now the floor to Mr. Syed Tayyabul Bashar, Executive Director of Save and Serve Foundation.
Thank you very much. To be honest, just to start off with, I would like to thank the organizers and Office of United Nations Office of Genocide Prevention for having me here. It's absolutely an honor to be here. And I wrote a 5-pager, but I won't go through it. I'll try and keep it short. And to be honest, listening to Mr. El-Sanoussi and from Sana, I'm a bit emotional because I just came from Bangladesh 3 days back after I was at a funeral where a nephew of my friend died in Sri Lanka in the bomb blast, and I was there at the funeral, and I wanted to see the body, but they didn't allow me because they said it's not in proper shape. So the next very day I was supposed to fly here, and then I get a phone call that my father, who fights against radical beliefs, actually got 2 phone calls, as in 2 death threats, that we will get you soon for your speeches against the radicalism. So yeah, coming here in this time, it's actually very, it shows how much this event and working on peace and justice, how important it is to us at the moment. To begin with, I would like to address that. I'd like to talk about the Rohingya crisis, which we are facing at the moment. And from our foundation, we work regarding SDG 16, which is peace and justice. So a bit of the Rohingya crisis I would like to explain to everyone here in the room. We have been in the camps, and to be honest, what we have seen in the camps is Bangladesh being one of the most populated country, densely populated country in the world. Recently, we got the developing nation status. We are hosting the largest influx of refugees or forcefully displaced citizens of Myanmar in Bangladesh at Cox's Bazar, which is the largest in the world at the moment. And the people of Bangladesh is sharing its food, its land and water happily, and we would like to see them being happy and go back to their country with dignity and pride one day, hopefully. But what I really want to focus on, to be honest, is not the development work, which is required in the camps, which is in a huge amount. But I really would like to talk about the mental trauma the Rohingya people are facing at the moment in the camp, or what they have seen in their time in Myanmar, in the Rakhine state. We talked to the elderly people, the children, and the women in the camps to figure out what was happening. And to be honest, after we came back from the camp, we were mentally disturbed listening to what horror they have gone through in the state of Rakhine. We were told that the elderly told us that they didn't sleep at night because they were scared that the military would come, pick up the boys from their houses and kill them. They were scared that the woman in the house would be raped. They were scared that they might not see the daylight the next day. They would also go and tell us that that even they didn't find their children, maybe they would find them in some mass graves which were around Rakhine state. If you go and talk to the woman there, it would kill you, to be honest, when they talk to you by looking straight into their face. They were raped by the military there in front of their kids and their husbands, and the brutality they faced in the land. And while talking to the children, you could see the innocence slowly fading away as they realize that they have seen their sisters, their mothers being raped, and they have seen their brothers, taking the names of their brothers, taken away from them, and killed and probably found the next very day in some kind of grave. The brutality is humongous. And to be honest, what we feel that it's very important to work regarding the case is that at the end of the day, they really want to go back to their home. And we really need to initiate dialogues with the government of Myanmar and through different agencies so that they can take them back and they can go back to their land peacefully with dignity and with pride. While saying it so, no one is actually working regarding their mental trauma they are going through. We need to actually impose or start working more regarding the mental trauma the Rohingya people are going through. We need to work to make sure they're mentally stable, they find a happy place, so that they could think forward of having a better life in Myanmar and to engage in dialogues as well. So in short, what we are seeing in the region of Rakhine, it's disastrous, and we are shocked to see that in the 21st century something like this could happen. So I would really urge the United Nations, everyone in this room, in the panel, everyone to really look into the matter, and we really need to win this war. It's actually a war. We need to stand by the Rohingyas. We need to make sure they're happy. We need to make sure they find their land and go back as a citizen with pride and with dignity. Saying it so, we are also, from our foundation, we are working regarding the minorities issue as well. Save and Serve Foundation is the largest inter-religion network in the country, and we are working regarding building peace between majority and minorities, and we have a lot of workshops taking place, and we are focused on building the largest network of our own throughout the country, and we plan to go international as well. Just to close off my speech, to be honest, is that we really need to act on it. It's time we act. We take all our possibilities, all our advantages, all our practices, experiences, take it together and move forward. And the last thing I would say is that what we have learned from our work is that if you really want to protect the religious minorities, if you really want to protect the refugees, you work with the majority. If you don't work with the majority, you cannot protect the rights of the religious minorities, and that's what one of our focus is as well. So I would really like to thank the organizers, and especially United Nations Office of Genocide and Prevention. Simona is here. At the same time, Mr. Dang is here. They were very supportive for us, and we continue to do other good work we're doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony, vivid testimony about the brutality and barbarian practices inflicted to the Rohingyas. It is amazing that such practices can take place at the time where we know so much about the universe, so much about God, so much about our own history, so much about the human being, and still we perpetrate these kind of practices. Thank you very much. I give the floor now to Mr. Faisal National Development Fund, Bangladesh.
Honorable Chair and Honorable Moderator. Honorable Chair, Honorable Moderator, and distinguished guest. I'm representing UNDP Bangladesh, where we have a program on preventing violent extremism under the big framework of SDG 16. To promoting peace and tolerance and justice in the society. So, importance of SDG in protecting rights of minorities and refugees and migrants is already covered mostly by first speaker and other speakers as well. So I want to pointing out some practical contextual challenges we are facing in UNDP program in engaging religious actors in promoting peace and tolerance, as there are so many distinguished religious actors and leaders are here. So I want to share the challenges of engaging religious leaders in Bangladesh context. So I'd like also to say that beside working through partner organizations like Save and Serve Foundation, we also work directly to engaging religious leaders. So when we bring together religious leaders of multiple faith in a neutral or secular space, the leaders, honorable leaders and actors, they show how peaceful is their religion is. Even sometimes, it's also sometimes sounds like they are showing supremacies rather than drawing any solutions. And we do interfaith dialogue in following the model practiced in different parts of the world, but the question is arised within our team that whether interfaith dialogue is relevant in Bangladesh, where 90% population is from one religion, that is Muslim. And this is also sad but true that superiority complex is a big issue in Muslim religious preachers of different schools. So that's why we think that interfaith dialogue is much more important as raised by delegation from Bahrain in previous sessions. But it's also challenging because when we call upon for interfaith dialogue within the Muslim community leaders, they say that, no, we don't have any sectarian issues. And the other point is, the other challenge is that is the real challenge actually we are facing, that the most religious actors like imam in our communities, imam in mosque in our communities, they are actually so marginalized. And they have less power because most of the imams and most of the religious actors, they don't have their own voices actually. They are using by local political elites, local political powers. So maybe it is good for promoting a secular space, secular society, but when we seek their influence to do something, to act something, we see that they don't have much power to do that. Rather, they have to more concerned about saving their own images as we pointing our finger to them after every terrorist incidents. So empowering religious leaders is actually important and actually critical, and we have to more creative in engaging with religious leaders than beyond our imagination actually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Majid. Indeed, the United Nations is called to take action in the field. You just gave us a concise explanation of what kind of difficulties the United Nations family can face in the field, and thank you very much. I give the floor now to Imam Razawi, Scottish Ahlul Bayt Society.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for holding this event and bringing diverse people into one room to discuss, to contemplate, and hopefully to get to some conclusions. Now, it's very difficult to come right at the end after having listened to some very passionate speeches and a lot of information. So within the 5 minutes that I do have, I'm going to concisely try and answer the 3 questions that were posed to me. Look, we all agree that we are living in very troubled times. It's not something that we thought we would be living in. The 21st century is not the way that we envisaged. If we go back to the history of Europe and after the war, when we said never again, what we're seeing, at least in the last 5 years, is the highest level of displacement that we've seen. So decades on, we've actually gone around in a circle. And we're still where we were, with certain moral questions, historic questions, political questions to be answered. So look, the question to me was about the SDGs. I think the answer is very simple. In principle, the SDGs were created so that no one would be left out. And I feel that be it minorities, be it refugees or otherwise, if any one member of any community is suffering, therefore, we are not doing what we should be doing. So I guess that really is a very simple answer. However, I wish it was that simple. The complexity is such that for any progress to be made requires all of us, from all tiers of society, to be working together. Without governmental support, we are not going to be able to achieve what the plan was by 2030. If you look at the situation taking place at the moment with upheaval, migration, or refugees, there are very few countries in the world who are actually living up to what they promised. you find certain countries, certain developed countries, with a high level of, you could say, an aging population. We also find, for example, in the workplace, there's a shortage of labor. Many of these countries could actually utilize those refugees. We're seeing maybe a handful of countries who are being burdened, and the reason why I use the term burdened is this, because we all agree to help one another, not to put the burden on one country or another. I find that there is a lot of inequality, especially when it comes to developed nations. You find many of those countries which are developing are taking that burden of humanity. And I find that that's a responsibility given by God to all of us. So we all share in this burden, and what this burden essentially is to take care of one another. And that is something today where interest is outstripping responsibility, empathy, and really what it is to be human. As human beings, we have a responsibility to human beings. And when that gets confused with my interests or my country's interests, it becomes rather sad. So here, in the 21st century, what can we do? So if you look at the second question, what are the positive steps? Look, you can't help migration from taking place. In our traditions, we find that, look, God has expanded this world for a reason. And yes, we've created man-made borders. But the fact is that in times of crisis, there needs to be safe, orderly migration with respect to human rights. And that today is not taking place, be it in the Western world or be it in the Middle East. We find that through the process of migration, there are gaps that can be filled in the economy. And those people who are migrating can also help their families who have been left behind, feeding back into families, feeding back into economies. But as I've only been given 5 minutes and we're not going to go on a rant, what I will say is this. Much has been mentioned about religious leaders. Yes, religious leaders play an instrumental role in mobilizing people. Why? Because as you've heard, they're people who are trusted. They're meant to be impartial. But the reality is, and we've just touched on it now, religious leaders, the majority of those leaders who are engaging at a very high level are not impartial anymore. They should be aligned to the United Nations, which gives checks and balances. But today, the vast majority of religious leaders in these corridors are aligned to a government or an interest of a government. Therefore, what that means is they lose their impartiality, and to an extent, they lose their morality. Religious leaders, if they're going to be successful, if they're going to have an impact, need to align themselves where there's 190-odd countries checking and balancing them. Otherwise, what happens is that the credibility of religion is on the line. So, yes, in an ideal world, I'd love to have religious leaders resolve the issue. In reality, they're not going to. They're not countries. They don't have access cash. And at the same time, many of them are aligning themselves with the interest of particular countries. However, what we can do as countries is this. Many a time you find that our national policies or programs do not incorporate religious leaders. You bring them in for verification and ratification, but they're not part of the process. And when they're not part of the process, they're not efficient to achieve those results that we want to achieve. Education, inclusion, joint initiatives. But I think there are 4 things that I'm going to mention that religious leaders can do to keep their impartiality and have an impact. And I think those 4 points are this. They can convene, and that's something which is important. We require more religious leaders to convene. In that way, they keep their impartiality and their respect in a community. When certain communities see their religious leaders aligning with one party or another, what happens is that it loses confidence in the faith. So as a convener, and you've seen only in the last couple of days what happened in South Sudan. Amazingly, to bring together religious denominations to try and solve an issue is quite profound. And so we need to follow more of that, individuals who are conveners. Second thing, I guess, go back to what religious leaders represent. Carers, people who empathize. As carers, we can have a huge impact on those people who are suffering. But the only way they can do that is they're apolitical. Third thing, they could be a critical friend in keeping the narrative ticking. Many a time we get sidelined. And we've been sidelined and we are being sidelined. So what we can do, or what religious leaders can do, to make sure the SDGs work is to stabilize, to make sure that things are ticking. The final thing I'm going to say really is this. We live in a world without trust. If a religious leader doesn't trust a politician, or a politician doesn't trust a religious leader, or if a Muslim doesn't trust a Christian, or a Christian, and more so sectarian now, if a Sunni doesn't trust a Shia, or a Shia doesn't trust a Sunni, or a Protestant or a Catholic don't trust each other, we have a miserable world. We need to do things to trust build. We need to establish friendships. It's a long-term process, but it's required. The only way we can give hope again to a world which is suffering is if we can come together to build trust amongst ourselves. You people are leaders. We're all leaders. Leadership, part of it, is to empower the other. I think it's about time. Otherwise, I don't think this 2030 goal will be achieved. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Eminency, for this very convincing plea and testimony about the credibility and the impartiality of religious leaders, the more convincing as it comes from inside. And also, we are grateful for your call to rebuild the trust as a key element in fighting these crises. Now, we have to move to the next series of speakers, the debate challengers. It's just, I'm ought to remind you that the key words, 5 minutes, are no longer valid. We are talking now about 3 minutes. So you had the very good example of a previous speaker's concision and substance are very compatible. So I give the floor to the next speaker on my list, which is Mrs. Nika Saidi, Conflict Prevention, Peace Building and Responsive Institution in UNDP. You have the floor, ma'am.
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I have 3 minutes, and I have to explain what UNDP does in 170 countries to work with the religious leaders. But thanks God that the distinguished panelists touched upon many issues. And thank you, UNDP in Bangladesh, to actually explaining what is happening on the ground. UNDP is working on SDG for UNDP. It's very important because it's framing everything we do till 2013. And we are not selecting one SDG over another SDG goals. All of them matters. As my colleague explains that, for example, within the SDG framework, the number 16, we are working on reconciliation and social cohesion. However, the main concept is ensuring the whole of government approach, whole of society approach. And then within that, for us, whole of the UN to working together. And thanks to Mr. Adamadian and his office, we are making sure the work happening in support of the refugee and immigrants and working with the religious leaders happening along with the other UN entities. Therefore, we are very much looking, as Sana mentioned, the host country, in host communities, because we are not responsible looking at the refugee. But what is happening? Are they ready to include the people who are coming back? And within the framework of violent extremism, the concept of return and reintegration and rehabilitation now is actually a very, very important discussion. What is happening when people coming who are not welcomed? And then we see within the SDG framework, we are very much focusing on the local level, but the SDG meant to connect us at the global level. What does that mean? Those violent extremist groups are connecting across the borders. How we are, religious leaders and people affiliated with the, they have passion for religion and the communities of faith connecting over the borders. And that's a question we need to answer. And that's why I think having such a spaces like here matters. Because are we connecting and bringing a different narrative to the narrative is being shared? How come one person from Australia could actually copy someone from Norway and the whole far-right approach? What is our narrative against that? And that's a question mark that we have at the UNDP, because we are also working across, with each government, but where we are coming from to connect and working. And therefore, working with each one of you, it's a value for us. We are working very closely with the Alliance. We are working closely with all the organizations here to be able to create this connection at the regional level, at the global level, and making sure that we are responding to such a huge question. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And no one can make better this demonstration of interlinkages and interdependence between the global and the local level like UNDP. Thank you very much, my dear colleague. And now I give the floor to Mrs. Diana Alai, representative to the United Nations of the Baha'i International Community. I don't have to give her any instruction about time management. She is a long-standing fighter in the Commission on Human Rights and Human Rights Council, so she'll know very well what to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll try my best to be brief. As a respondent, I didn't really prepare a statement, but I wanted to give you some thoughts also based on what was already been said. I think the main issue that I wanted to focus on concerning the SDG is this concept that was mentioned already about leave no one behind. And this leave no one behind, I think, is an issue that really is very important when we look at religious minorities. And I think that really, if we want the concept of leave no one behind to be effective and implemented and succeed, we have to look at what's said also previously, at this idea of inclusivity. If we are not inclusive, then of course there will be some that will be left behind. What does that mean, this concept of inclusivity, particularly for religious minorities? Well, first of all, it's a question of the definition of a religious minority. I think that sometimes there is a tendency of wanting to have a certain set of notions of what is a religious minority. And I think this is where the first error, if you will, is made. The Special Rapporteurs on Freedom of Religion or Beliefs, from Abdel Fattah Amor to Asma Jahangir to Heiner Bielefeld and now to Ahmed Shahid, they have all said that it is not for a state to decide what is a religion and what is not. And unfortunately, in many states which have certain recognized religious minorities, then the other religious minorities are completely left behind. I would beg to differ with our colleague who said that, you know, sometimes a numerical is a minority, it's a majority somewhere else. Well, no, there are some minorities that are minorities everywhere. And I think that, in fact, they are the most vulnerable because they have no one to challenge and defend them. Because if you are from a minority that is a majority somewhere else, well, that majority has a voice in that particular country and can make noise. But if you're a minority everywhere, then who speaks up for you? And then how do we fulfill this idea of leave no one behind? And I just wanted to say that sometimes we have a tendency, and we heard it even in this meeting, of speaking of the religions of the book. And I think that we should remember that there are other religious minorities and other religions that are not religions of the book. And so when we talk about inclusion again, we should really try to go beyond these concepts that are actually exclusive rather than being inclusive. Another thing that I wanted to say about this leave no one behind is that we have to also consider those countries that actually, as a matter of government policy, exclude minorities from attaining the SDGs, from accessing education, from accessing employment, as a government policy. And how is the SDG going to challenge, and is the UN going to challenge those countries by not looking only at the positive of how we're implementing the SDGs, but also how we're preventing ourselves through a number of policies to actually reach this leave no one behind. Finally, as a last point, I wanted to speak about an experience that we have of actually minorities, persecuted minorities, contributing to the SDGs by this concept of constructive resilience, when the minorities who are persecuted actually decide, rather than take arms or take the same tools of their oppressors, to decide to work shoulder to shoulder with others, with the majorities, with their fellow citizens, in order to contribute to the betterment of society and to contribute to the advancement and the achievement of SDGs. And I think that if we would really focus on this constructive resilience that is happening in many countries by persecuted minorities, then I think that we have one of the key answers to the implementation of the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diana, for showing us the complexity of even the terminology we are using about minorities and the complexities of the problems triggered by this kind of taxonomies. I now give the floor to Dr. Jose Maria Puyol Montero, Professor of History of Law in the institution Universidad Complutense de Madrid. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank the organizers for this invitation to be here. Is for me a big honor. And well, I would like to focus my intervention on two messages that seem to me both simple but fundamental. We must promote respect for human dignity and individual freedom of each person through education. I think is one thing that you have heard in this summit very frequently. I think it's very, very important, education. The second point, we must promote through friendship between persons, between people, and between communities, as a tool to guarantee peace and respect for dignity of each person and of each community. First point, human dignity is often present in constitutional texts, but unfortunately, beautiful statements are made that are often not applied in practice and are not respected in many cases. Respect for human dignity must be in education and not only in law, if we want to be really effective. There must be a real effort to incorporate this principle into all education systems as something sacred. Everyone must be aware since childhood of the high dignity of every human person who deserves all respect, attention, and protection, whether he or she is ill, elderly, or a child, born or not, rich or poor, national or foreign, or of a different religion. We must learn to live with people who have different opinions and respect their symbols and convictions as something really sacred for each person. A great richness of our societies is diversity. Diversity enriches us as we have much to learn from each other. We must learn to live with diversity. We must promote through education that there is always a real respect for the dignity of each person. Second point, we must use education to promote another tool that is very useful for the promotion of peace and respect for the dignity of each person. Through friendship between people, between communities, between persons, promoting through friendship between people and between communities is a formidable instrument to achieve peace and coexistence in the world. It means building bridges, admiring others, or a sincere and enriching dialogue. These are the fruits of the promotion of a true friendship. In conclusion, I would like to say that human dignity in education and through friendship are two weapons with which many of the world's problems will find a solution, in my opinion. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Professor Montero. I think I trust that the graduates from the Università Complutense will leave the university with a solid knowledge about religions and about non-use of violence and other discriminations forms. We have another academic in the panel, so I would like to invite Dr. Luca Ozzano, professor at the University of Turin. Have the floor.
Thank you, and thanks to the organizer for inviting me to this event. Many of the previous contributions have been focused and been proposed by people who work with refugees and with religious minorities who help them. On the other hand, I'm a political scientist, and in the past years I've been working a lot on religion and political parties, and particularly on the role of religion in the discourse and policies of right-wing populist political parties, so people and organizations who are mainly hostile towards immigrants, towards religious minorities and refugees. When I studied these parties, there was something that struck me really strong. The fact that, of course, we know that they are hostile toward religious minorities and immigrants, we all know this, but I started to understand that this hostility is only a tile in a larger picture of hostility towards any kind of diversity, which can be a rejection of religious diversity, ethnic diversity, skin diversity, sexual diversity, and so on. A rejection which is a rejection of everything that does not adjust to an image of a mythical identity of which a society where everybody is white, Christian, heterosexual, preferably male, had a good job, and so on. And so, as a consequence, if we look at the attitudes that these parties adopted towards immigrant religious minorities, this attitude is not much different from those adopted towards ethnic minorities, feminists, young climate activists, community organizers, LGBT rights activists, and several other categories. And this, of course, is not only the case of populist parties in Europe, but of other movements around the world. So what does this signal us? I think it means that we cannot talk about the protection of religious minorities without linking this issue to the protections of other rights, of all rights, human rights and political rights alike. Because the protection of religious rights can only happen within an open democratic society which protects religious minorities and those non-believers and people who change religion, as well as workers, gender minorities, poor people, people with dissenting political views, and a society which enhances people's participation and contribution at all levels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this plea for a holistic approach for the protection of all human rights with respect to all vulnerable or minority categories. So I'm grateful to the speakers for doing their really their best to respect the time limits. We have, I could ask myself, how did it get so late so soon? But still we have 20 minutes left for debate, so the best is yet to come. I would kindly invite people from the floor to ask questions, make comments, and of course they should present themselves and be as concise as possible. I see two hands. Ladies first, you have the floor, madam.
Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Beato, and I'm representing Youth with a Mission. It's an NGO that is in most countries doing a lot of grassroots work and training youth. And today we're talking a lot about building bridges, fostering inclusivity, and countering hate speech. And I heard a lot about education. But I'd like to suggest that education is beyond schools and is also in the homes. And I think we need to build this bridge between generations, because we cannot just take the voice from the older people and give to the young people, because if they come without any foundation, they'll come with lack of understanding and maybe in pride or even in apathy. But if we build them up and give them foundation, to have their own opinion and bring something new, then they can be strong and compassionate and grateful and honoring the other generations. So I'd like to suggest that we need to strengthen families, because most things that we learn at home. Thank you.
Have the floor, sir. Thanks.
Suhail Al-Ghusaybi from the Bahrain Foundation for Dialogue. I have two quick comments. One is on religious leaders. I come from an area in the world where sectarianism is rising, and we have a lot of religious tensions. And it's interesting, from my perspective, I think religious leaders are a huge part of the problem and a huge part of the solution. So it's interesting how one navigates that. And I think one of the ways to promote peace through a religious lens is to go back to Quranic principles and to focus on what is actually mentioned in the holy books. So this is just a comment. The other thing is on refugees and immigrants. In order to help immigrants and refugees, I think we must understand the fear that comes from the far right. We shouldn't vilify the far right. We should seek to understand them, as someone in the panel said, to coordinate with the majority or communicate with the majority. It is fundamental to understand where their fears are coming from, because if we address those fears, I think we can help reduce intolerance and violent action towards refugees and immigrants. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have three items proposed to the attention of the panelists. One is about education behind the homes. The other is about the religious leaders that are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And the other one on how to address the fears. These are very important points, and I would invite any of the panelists to respond.
Should I go first? Yeah. Regarding the education, we have the last event we have done back in Bangladesh with UNDP as our partner and with UN Office of Genocide and Prevention. We had a 2 days workshop done on education and what should be the role of education and the role of religious scholars and actors when it came to building a more fostering and inclusive society. Some of the key points we got out from that is that while we work regarding education, it's not just working with the students or with the scholars or with universities. We actually got some very good points that we really need to show in Southeast Asia. Homemakers are very influential in building up the next generation, and especially the woman in a house or the woman in a family is very influential in Southeast Asia. And some of our female participants actually located us that we really need to start focusing, working in groups, cluster group, not to just promote women empowerment, but use their intellectuals, the way they build families in Southeast Asia context to build up the next generation. So the next, we are coming up with the help of United Nations Office of Genocide and Prevention. It's called Alternative Curriculum for Religious Practices. We have all the religion together, and we are building the curriculum in such a way that it is not towards just students, not towards the scholars, but also to homemakers, be it a male or a female, at the same time to the seniors of the societies who play a very important role in the coming days. So it's very important that if you really want to focus on working with the next generation, you have to also work with the homemakers. So I think I answered the question as well. Thank you.
Diane?
I'll be brief. Just to respond, I think the issue with the religious leaders is really that the call to the religious leaders should be to get rid of the concepts of exclusivity and finality. And I think that if they're ready to get rid of these two concepts, then I think that we can have a much more constructive discussion between religious leaders. The second is, I think yesterday in her speech, the High Commissioner mentioned that, but it's this endeavor that the OHCHR is doing, and which our organization participated, about faith for rights, which is actually bringing through religious scriptures the understanding of what human rights stands for. And I think that this is also a very interesting approach that could be very useful. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. De Faria, please.
Yeah, it's related to the education, the first comment from the plenary. I think that first of all, we need to think what kind of education we are talking about. Because if you will just follow that we need to educate, but we will be following the outcome from this intersection of fundamentalisms that I mentioned in the beginning, the religious, economic, and also political fundamentalism, we see in many, many countries today people changing the concept of education, bringing exclusive policies and trying to treat people with different concepts that are undermining human rights. You need to be very much aware of that and not to go into the trap of just put education, and we need to see what kind of educations, if they are based on the human rights framework or not. And that includes also the same concept that you mentioned in terms of families. Because if you see from the religious perspectives, many of them are also pushing concepts that are completely excluding people and putting minorities at risk. We mentioned here several times the sexual identity, for instance. So just a word of caution on that.
Thank you. Imam Razawi.
Again, just to supplement some of the points that have been made, I think dialogue is very important, be it between religious leaders. Even in times of tension, it's important to carry on the dialogue, albeit with the far right or other forms of ideology which we may not agree with. So that's the first thing. I think dialogue is very important in regards to the question on religious leaders. I think in an ideal world, yes, there needs to be dialogue that takes place, but I think you took a particular example, and I think that example has less to do with religious leaders, but it has a history that dates back to more countries involved in a particular country. So I think even if we were to get the religious leaders together, I don't think it would solve the sectarian issue that you talk about.
Thank you very much. Nika?
Just to add, UNDP did a study, Journey to Extremism, and actually 80% of the people who have joined violent extremism group have literally no religious education or no understanding of their own religion. So it's very interesting to look at what we can do in providing the actual, a right understanding of the religious literacy that they need to have to not be able to join the violent extremist group.
Joao?
Yes, thank you. I truly believe that family education is as important as school education and as religious education. But what we have seen with many of the refugees coming into Europe in the last years is that there are many unaccompanied minors. And for them, so they don't have a family that they can rely on. And we need to compensate that. We need to work with them to try to give them access to these education systems that can allow them to have a future. So when family education is possible, of course, this is a very important topic and a very important point. But sometimes with this crisis, it's just not possible because the family is not there. And on the last point, on the fears of the far right, yes, that's why we are here. I think we need to talk about this. We need to raise these issues. We need to understand all the different points. We need to dialogue, and we need to understand each other and to try to find bridges and points on how to demystify some of the myths that are coming up.
Thank you. Elisabeta?
The Conference of European Churches has human rights education program. That means that every year we run a summer school on human rights, and this program was requested by young people coming from the member churches and young theologians, because for us who studied Christian theology, it is rarely that we actually learn about human rights or international law principles, etc. This is why this request was fairly accepted, was very well accepted by young people coming from the CAC member churches, where every year they choose one of the subjects and then we discuss theology and certain right. For this year, we have selected the subject freedom of expression, theology, and populism, where we are planning basically to invite also representatives of the Muslim organizations and Jewish organizations, in order to tackle how we could together eradicate anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in Europe. I believe that just really together, by creating partnership, we can really achieve good results. And what Imam Brazavi said, that through the friendships, I think we can really achieve the best results when we stand together in solidarity for one another.
Thank you. When I was in my past work ambassador of the Council of Europe to the Human Rights Council, I had, as an observer, the right to speak for 2 minutes. There are still 2 minutes. I won't waste these 2 minutes. So who is capable to make a meaningful statement in 2 minutes is invited to take the floor. The permanent delegate of Brazil, please.
Thank you very much. Brazil thanks the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and ADRA for organizing this summit. I'll make a few comments, and if I leave a question for the panel in these 2 minutes. As a country that values and protects its rich religious diversity, Brazil believes that spirituality, religion, and belief can contribute to promote the inherent dignity of the human person and to the eradication of racism, xenophobia, and all forms of discrimination. They can also play a key role in leaving no one behind. For instance, partnership with religious actors has been key in our efforts to assist migrants and refugees recently arriving in our country. In Brazil, we had a twofold approach on religious intolerance. Religious intolerance is a crime, punishable with detention and fine, but we also adopt positive measures to safeguard religious diversity. We have awareness campaigns every day. On January 21st. There is a national day to counter religious intolerance. In his first days in office, President Bolsonaro enacted a law guaranteeing students the right to be absent from activities when they are scheduled in days incompatible with their religion. We are seriously concerned at multiplying and worsening acts of intolerance and violence based on religion or belief, including against religious minorities all over the world. Many speakers already mentioned the attacks on mosques in Christchurch, on several churches in Sri Lanka, and on synagogues in Pittsburgh, and just 2 days ago near San Diego, as disturbing evidence of this trend. Brazil once again strongly condemns the terrorist attacks in Sri Lanka, which killed and injured hundreds of people on Easter Sunday. Persecution, discrimination, and violence against Christians worldwide are a growing concern of our government. Many speakers today and yesterday mentioned the role of the internet and social media in spreading hate speech and incitement to violence. And my question is, how can we better involve the information technology sector as a key partner in this dialogue to counter this trend? I thank you very much, and I hope I was within the 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, distinguished delegate of Brazil. Yes, a good question. How shall we prevent hate speech on social media and on the internet? Who is the most literate in the matter? Please, you have the floor.
Go on. I really wanted to address this point as well. One of the biggest concerns right now is the social media, it's the internet, how it is being used. It's not terrorism or hate message, it's not just based in one place anymore, one country, it's worldwide phenomena. And the problem is, one of our brothers just said of using religious leaders. The problem is, are we using religious leaders, or the so-called popular religious leaders are taking over the space of the digital market or the internet? It's very important to work on the social media space, because what we have seen, that we have challenged and fought against the radical people or the people who gives hate message in the root level in Bangladesh. But the problem we face is all the YouTube channels which are broadcasting very hardline messages, either from anywhere from around the corner. So what do we do actually from a point of view where we could connect together and take the fight forward? Along with UNDP, we have a project. It's in the digital space. We are calling it Fostering Inclusive Tolerant Society in the Digital Space, and the role of religious leaders and actors with the Office of United Nations, Office of Genocide and Prevention. So while we are working through it, market, we are also actually trying to how to integrate the whole international market together, because it's not possible just for a country or for a group to come up and fight this hate message or hate crime. So it's very important we all sit together, build up a content, which is the most important and which is missing, build up a content which we all could use together in fighting the hate message in the social media and in the internet space. Thank you.
Thank you. With all gratitude for my speakers, my panel, the panel I moderated, time's up for this panel. So I would like to invite you to join my personal thanks to the panelists. Sorry, Rabbi, if you, well, yes, I'd like to hear you, please.
Question. Everybody has talked about education. We need to educate the children, we need to educate the grown-ups, we need to educate the homes, and it's very important, apparently. And I've been convinced by the speakers, and we need not to fall in the trap of how, and we must do it and so on. But nobody said, how exactly is this going to be implemented? So the wise people on this panel should maybe tell us, how are we going to implement that all the important principles which have been talked about, how is that going to exactly happen? How are all the principles talked about, how is this going to be implemented as education of the homes, of the families, of the grown-ups, and of the children? Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm sure that the panelists will take this question with them. Some of them are professors, so I'm sure that they have some answers, but unfortunately, we cannot continue the debate. I thank you very much for your patience. I thank you very much, the panelists, for observing the time's rules, and I think they deserve some applauses from all of us. Thank you.